Right now, you can cross an ocean in 12 hours. You barely think about it. You strap into a metal tube, fall asleep, and wake up on a different continent. But 60,000 years ago, someone made that same journey with no plane, no map, no compass, and no idea what was on the other side. They just walked. And then they kept walking for generations. The real answer to how humans spread across the entire planet is far stranger than they wandered off. It was not random. It was not accidental. It was one of the most relentless, most quietly heroic processes in the history of life on Earth. Start with a simple fact. Every single human being alive today, no matter where they were born, traces their ancestry back to a small population in Africa. Not thousands of separate origins. One, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerged there. For a long time, that was it. That was a whole species, contained on one continent. Then something changed. Around 70,000 years ago, give or take, groups of humans began moving out of Africa in waves. Not a single dramatic exodus, not a heroic march with a destination in mind. Small groups, following rivers, following coastlines, following animals. Each generation pushing slightly further than the last without ever intending to conquer a planet. Here's the part that should stop you. They had no idea what they were doing. Nobody stood at the edge of Africa and said, let's go populate every continent on Earth. There was no plan. There was no map on a wall. Movement happened one valley at a time, one coastline at a time, one river crossing at a time. A journey that eventually spanned tens of thousands of kilometers was never experienced by any single person as a journey. It was experienced as a life. A normal life lived slightly further from home than your parents lived from theirs. Chris Stringer, one of the paleoanthropologists most associated with the modern understanding of human origins, has spent decades piecing together this story from fossils and skulls scattered across 3 continents. His research helped confirm what is now called the out of Africa model. Not because humans left in one heroic wave, but because the fossil and genetic evidence both point to Africa as a shared root of every human lineage alive today. Every group that left from the same place. Every group that stayed in the place all of us ultimately come from. But knowing where humans started is the easy part. The real mystery is how they got everywhere else. Because this was not an era of ships and satellites. This was an era of stone tools, animal hides, and fire that had to be carried, not switched on. Think about what it actually takes to cross unfamiliar terrain with nothing but what your body can carry. No forecast for tomorrow's weather. No knowledge of what predators wait beyond the next ridge. No certainty that there is fresh water on the other side. Every step is a decision made with incomplete information. And yet, generation after generation, that decision kept getting made. One of the earliest and most important routes out of Africa followed the coastline, not the open ocean. The edge of it. Humans moving along coast had a built-in survival advantage most people never think about. Shellfish, fish, seaweed. A coastline is one of the most reliable food sources on Earth because the tide resets it every single day. You do not need to hunt a fast-moving animal across open plains. You just need to walk along the shore and pick up what the sea leaves behind. This is sometimes called the coastal migration route, and it may explain how humans spread from Africa through the Arabian Peninsula and along the southern edge of Asia in a remarkably short span of time, geologically speaking. Not because they were fast, because the coastline was, in a sense, a highway that fed itself. Now, here is where it gets stranger. Some of these early humans did something that should not have been possible without any of the technology we associate with sailing. They crossed open water. 50,000 years ago, or possibly earlier, humans arrived in Australia. Australia has never been connected to mainland Asia by a land bridge, not in the entire time humans have existed. Even during the ice ages, when sea levels dropped and exposed vast stretches of land elsewhere, there was still open ocean between the islands of Southeast Asia and the Australian continent. Which means someone, or some group, built something that could float, loaded it with people, and pushed off into water they could not see the other side of. Think about what that requires. Not just courage, planning. You need enough people to make a viable population on the other side. You need to carry fire, or a way to make fire, because a landmass with no humans on it might also have no easy way to start one. You need food for the crossing, because you have no idea how long it will take or what you'll find when you land. This was not a single confused canoe drifting off course. This was an intentional act repeated by different groups that succeeded often enough to leave descendants who are still there today. Rebecca Ragg Sykes, an archaeologist who has spent much of her career studying ancient hominins and their capabilities, has argued that we consistently underestimate what these populations were capable of. Not because the evidence is missing, but because modern assumptions about primitive ancestors get in the way of reading the evidence clearly. People capable of building working seacraft, coordinating a multi-day crossing, and successfully establishing a population on an unseen shore were not primitive in any meaningful sense. They were expert problem solvers operating with an intimate, generational knowledge of their environment. While some populations pushed across open water, others pushed across land that no longer exists. During the last ice age, so much of Earth's water was locked into glaciers that sea levels dropped dramatically. Places that are now separated by ocean were, for a window of thousands of years, connected by dry land. The most famous of these is Beringia, the land bridge that once connected Siberia to Alaska, spanning what is now the Bering Strait. Beringia was not a narrow strip you could sprint across. At its widest, it stretched over 1,000 kilometers from north to south. It had its own ecosystem: grasses, shrubs, herds of mammoths, bison, and other now extinct megafauna. For the humans who lived there, Beringia was not a bridge they were crossing. It was home. Some populations may have lived on this land bridge for thousands of years before ever continuing east into what is now North America. This detail matters because it destroys the image most people carry in their heads. Nobody walked from Siberia to Alaska in a single lifetime, following some inner compass toward a new continent. Families were born on Beringia. They grew old on Beringia. Their children buried them on Beringia. The migration into the Americas was not a journey. It was a homeland that slowly extended itself eastward over dozens of generations, until one day, without anyone marking the occasion, humans were standing on a continent nobody like them had ever seen. And once they arrived, they kept moving, fast, faster than almost any other human migration in history. Within roughly 1,000 years, some researchers argue populations had spread from the northern edge of the Americas all the way down to the southern tip of South America, a distance of over 15,000 kilometers. Some scientists debate the exact speed and route, but the broad pattern is not in dispute. Humans arrived in a landmass that had never known them, and their descendants covered nearly its entire length in a fraction of the time it took to leave Africa in the first place. Why the difference in speed? Partly because the Americas were, in a sense, an open door. No competing human populations to displace. Abundant, unfamiliar megafauna that had never learned to fear a human hunter. And a landscape that, while varied, offered continuous paths south through valleys, along rivers, and eventually along the Pacific coast, where the same shellfish and shoreline strategy that worked in Asia worked again in the Americas. Here is a question worth sitting with. How did they know where they were going? They didn't. Not in the way you know where you are going when you check a map on your phone. What they had instead was something more remarkable in some ways: a working knowledge, passed down and refined over generations, of how to read a landscape, which direction rivers tend to flow toward larger bodies of water, which plants signal fresh water nearby, how animal migration patterns shift with the seasons, and how following those patterns leads to food. Navigation was not a single skill. It was an entire inherited library of environmental literacy, carried in stories, in songs, in the practical knowledge parents pass to children simply by living alongside them. This is easy to miss because we tend to imagine ancient humans discovering places the way an astronaut discovers a new planet. Alone, sudden, dramatic. But almost none of it worked that way. A group might move 20 kilometers over a generation, not because they were slow, but because moving further wasn't necessary yet. Resources were sufficient where they were. Then a drought came, or a rival group arrived, or the herds they depended on shifted their range, and the next 20 kilometers got covered, not out of ambition, but out of necessity. Multiply that pattern by hundreds of generations, across thousands of years, and you get a species that quietly, almost accidentally, ends up on every continent except Antarctica. There's a genetic fingerprint left behind by all of this, and it is one of the most elegant pieces of evidence in the entire story. Mitochondrial DNA, passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, allows scientists to trace maternal lineages back through thousands of generations. Rebecca Cahn's research in the late 1980s used exactly this method to trace all living humans back to a common maternal ancestor who lived in Africa, sometimes referred to, a little dramatically, as mitochondrial Eve. She was not the first human woman, and she was not alone at the time she lived. She was simply the most recent common maternal ancestor whose lineage survived unbroken into the present. Every other maternal line that existed alongside her eventually ended, generation after generation, until hers was the only one left standing. Later researchers, including geneticist Spencer Wells through the Genographic Project, expanded this kind of tracing using markers on the Y chromosome and broader population genetics, mapping out branching migration routes that align remarkably well with the archaeological evidence. Where fossils are scarce, DNA fills in the gaps. Where DNA is ambiguous, fossils and tools confirm the timeline. The two forms of evidence, built by entirely different scientific methods, keep landing on the same basic story. Now, think about what that means for you personally, sitting wherever you are right now. The device you're using to watch this, the chair you're sitting in, the building around you, none of it existed for almost the entire span of this migration. For most of human history, all you had was your body, your knowledge, and the people around you willing to walk the next 20 kilometers with you. And somehow, that was enough to fill an entire planet. There's a kind of restlessness built into being human that doesn't always make logical sense. You feel it when you've lived in the same place too long. You feel it staring at a map, wondering what's actually out there beyond the places you know. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a mix of curiosity and risk tolerance, traits that would have been actively selected for in a species whose survival, again and again, depended on someone being willing to go just a little further than the last generation did. The humans who stayed perfectly still, generation after generation, are not disproportionately represented in your ancestry. The ones who moved are. You are not just descended from survivors, you are descended from walkers. From people who crossed straits of open water without knowing what was on the other side, from families who were born and died on a strip of land that has been underwater for thousands of years, from groups who looked at a horizon with no roads, no signs, and no certainty, and decided the next 20 kilometers were worth the risk. So the next time you feel that pull to see what's beyond the place you already know, you're not being irrational, you're not being reckless, you're doing the single most human thing there is. Right now, you can cross an ocean in 12 hours and you barely think about it. But somewhere in you, quietly, is the same instinct that once carried your ancestors across an entire planet on foot, one uncertain step and one uncertain generation at a time.